The goal of individuation is none other than to strip the self of the false wrappings of the persona, as well as of the suggestive power of primordial images. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. It brings erosion. You know it when you're sitting across from someone, speaking with your whole heart, and they're scrolling to their phone, nodding absently. Their body is there, but their soul isn't. You lean forward to connect, but something inside you quietly leans back, almost protecting itself. And in that invisible retreat, your spirit whispers a truth your mind refuses to name. They're not really listening. You've felt it, haven't you? That quiet sting that arrives without sound. That moment when you realize you could disappear mid-sentence, and they wouldn't notice. When your story is met with distracted or a fake smile that never reaches the eyes. It's not the words that hurt. It's the lack of presence behind them. Because respect isn't built through speeches. It's built through attention. And when attention is gone, dignity begins to fade. Maybe it happens at work, when your ideas are brushed aside until someone else repeats them louder. Or at home, when every conversation becomes a competition for who's right instead of an invitation to understand. Sometimes it happens with those we love the most, the ones who should see us most clearly, the ones whose eyes used to feel like shelter and now feel like glass. Carl Jung once said that the unconscious speaks through symbols long before the tongue moves. You can sense disrespect before it's declared. Because the psyche feels truth faster than reason. A tightening in your chest when someone mocks you in the name of humor. A sudden wave of exhaustion after being around people who drain more than they give. Your body records every tone, every glance, every omission. The ego may pretend not to notice, but the soul never lies. Disrespect doesn't always shout. It leaks. It shows up in unfinished messages, in the way someone sighs when you speak, and how their silence grows heavier than their words. It's the invisible rejection that your conscious mind tries to explain away. They're just tired. I'm being sensitive. But the truth is, the unconscious recognizes danger in subtle vibrations. Jung called this the autonomy of the unconscious, the way it reacts on its own, signaling what the mind is not yet named. Imagine looking into a mirror covered with fog. You can see the outline of yourself, but the details are gone. That's what it feels like to be unseen, to keep reflecting through someone who no longer reflects you back. Every ironic laugh, every absent glance, every conversation left hanging adds another layer of mist until you start doubting your own worth. You begin to think, maybe you expect too much. You start shrinking your voice, trimming your truth, try to fit into a silence that was never yours. But here's the turning point. The unconscious doesn't only register pain. It demands balance. When you suppress your anger, your dreams begin to scream it. When you tolerate disrespect, your body carries the weight until it aches. When you betray your boundaries, the psyche creates symptoms to remind you that something sacred is being violated. Jung wrote that what you resist not only persists but grows in size. Silence can protect you for a moment, but over time it becomes a very cage that keeps you small. So maybe this isn't just about others not listening. Maybe it's about how often we silence ourselves to keep the peace. How often we stay at tables where we are no longer truly seen, hoping that politeness will buy love, or that patience will earn respect. But love built on fear of conflict isn't love, it's submission. And every time we swallow the truth to avoid rejection, a small part of the soul begins to vanish. This video is about recognizing the moment before that disappearance. It's about learning to hear what your silence has been trying to say all along, to see how your unconscious body, through gestures, tone, and dreams, has been warning you where respect no longer lives. Because before every act of disrespect, there's a quieter one. The moment you felt the sting and convinced yourself it didn't matter. So stay with me. We're about to uncover why we allow this erosion to continue, why we keep showing up in spaces that shrink us, and what your silence, this polite, wounded silence, has been revealing about the parts of you still waiting to be heard. We all wear a mask. Some call it politeness, others call it maturity, but Jung called it the persona, the social face we show to be accepted, to belong, to survive. It's the smile you put on when you're falling apart inside, the agreeable nod when your heart is screaming to disagree, the calm tone you use when someone crosses a line, just so the air doesn't get too heavy. The persona protects you, but at a cost. The more you wear it, the more it begins to replace your true reflection. That's how disrespect begins, not always with cruelty, but with disconnection. When people stop relating to your soul and start relating only to your mask, you become what they expect, not who you are. You learn which parts of yourself are too much, which truths make others uncomfortable. And so, you trim your essence to fit their comfort. Every time you do, a small fracture appears in the mirror of your dignity. At first, it's almost invisible, but soon, the cracks spread until a reflection staring back feels unfamiliar. Think of Daniel, a man who once spoke with conviction. In meetings, his ideas had light. His voice carried weight. But over time, he noticed the subtle sides of his. Boss, the impatient tapping of fingers when he spoke too long. Now, he smiles politely, agreeing to plans he knows will fail, silencing insights that could have made a difference. On the outside, he's a model employee, respectful, composed, efficient. But inside, something begins to decay. His silence is no longer peace. It's surrender. Or imagine a woman in love who laughs when her partner teases her. Even when the joke's cut too deep, she tells herself he doesn't mean it. She hides behind humor because speaking her truth feels dangerous. Her laughter becomes armor, thin, fragile, and slowly breaking. Both Daniel and her have one thing in common. They've mistaken suppression for strength. They've traded authenticity for acceptance. And isn't that something we've all done? How many times have you smiled through humiliation just to keep the connection alive? How many times have you lowered your volume, softened your truth, or laughed at your own pain just to be chosen? How many times have you mistaken being agreeable for being loved? We learn to perform safety, not to live truth. But here's the hidden cost. Every time you silence your inner voice to please another, the psyche takes note. It doesn't forget. Jung taught that everything repressed returns, not as virtue, but as shadow. The shadow is not evil. It's the part of you that got tired of being ignored. It carries all the emotions you've swallowed: anger, humiliation, grief, and the fierce demand to be seen. It waits patiently in the dark corners of your consciousness, whispering, "Remember me." And when that whisper grows too loud, it begins to leak through your actions. You start snapping at small things, withdrawing from people you once loved, sabotaging your own peace. It's not madness. It's the soul's rebellion against falseness. The mask you built to protect yourself begins to crack under the weight of your unspoken truth. That's what the broken mirror symbolizes. The shattering of the persona when it can no longer contain the soul. Each piece reflects a part of you that once had a voice. The more you try to polish the mask, the sharper those fragments become, cutting you from the inside. So the real question isn't how to keep the mask intact. It's whether you're brave enough to take it off. Because when you spent years being liked, it feels terrifying to be real. But authenticity, though costly, is the only currency of respect that lasts. Still, there's a moment of danger, a moment when the repressed voice refuses to stay quiet, when the shadow, long denied, begins to speak in your place. Not through words, but through silence, withdrawal, and self-sabotage. And that's where the story turns. Because when the shadow starts speaking for you, even your silence begins to sound like a scream. When the mask begins to crack, the body becomes a messenger. What the mouth refuses to say, the muscles whisper. What the heart hides, the nervous system announces. This is how the psyche speaks when the conscious self won't listen. You might think you're keeping the peace by staying quiet, but your body knows better. It keeps score. Your shoulders tighten every time you swallow an unspoken truth. Your jaw locks after every fake smile. You wake up tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of words never said. Jung wrote that the unconscious compensates for the one-sided attitudes of consciousness. When you tolerate disrespect, when you play small to avoid rejection, you create an imbalance between your inner truth and your outer behavior. The unconscious then steps in to restore equilibrium, not gently but insistently. It will use anxiety to make you pause. It will use exhaustion to slow you down. It will even use physical pain as a last resort, because the psyche's mission is not comfort, it's wholeness. Think of your mind and body as twin instruments tuned to the same vibration. When one plays false, the other goes out of tune. You can't pretend to be fine without the body echoing the lie. Every sigh, every knot in the stomach, every sudden fatigue is a symbolic protest. Your soul saying, I can't keep pretending. Jung saw symptoms not as enemies, but as messages in disguise. They are the language of the soul when the ego has lost its voice. You've probably seen this in your own life. The woman who laughs at her boss's cruel jokes, then gets migraines every weekend. The man who never says no, but feels an unexplained pressure in his chest. The friend who stays in a draining relationship, always tired, always apologizing. The world sees their smiles, but their bodies tell a different story. That tension, that heaviness, that inner trembling. It's the psyche demanding truth. Every time you suppress anger to appear kind, that emotion doesn't vanish. It sinks into the unconscious, growing roots. Over time, those roots become symptoms. Anxiety isn't always fear of the future. Sometimes it's the body's rebellion against the present that feels false. Depression, too, can be the soul's protest against a life that has drifted too far from authenticity. You can numb it, you can ignore it, but you can't outsmart it. The unconscious waits patiently for honesty, and yet we keep pretending. We tell ourselves, it's not a big deal, while our energy drains like a leaking vessel. We think endurance is strength, when in truth, it's often self-betrayal wearing a medal. Respect begins where denial ends. Because you cannot expect others to value you while you quietly participate in your own diminishing. The body will not let you stay asleep forever. It will shake you awake through fatigue, silence, or breakdown until you remember what dignity feels like. So, if lately you've been feeling heavy for no reason, if you can't explain why peace feels distant even when life looks fine, ask yourself, what truth am I hiding from my own voice? What boundary have I allowed to dissolve in the name of harmony? Because fatigue is not always physical. It's sometimes the exhaustion of carrying a self that's only half alive. The body doesn't lie. It mirrors the soul's truth when the ego insists on illusion. You can silence your words, but not your energy. The unconscious will find a way to balance what the conscious mind distorts. And this is where the danger begins. Because when you keep tolerating what wounds you, the psyche stops waiting for you to act. It begins to act for you, through symptoms, through distance, through silence. But there's something even more dangerous than being disrespected by others. It's when, without realizing it, you start disrespecting yourself. There comes a point when silence stops being protection and becomes erosion. You've been polite for so long that your own voice starts to fade. You lower your tone to avoid tension. You apologize before speaking. You shrink so others can feel taller. At first, it feels noble, peaceful, even, but what you're really doing is slowly disappearing. Each time you betray your truth for acceptance, a piece of your soul drifts further from home, until one day, you wake up and don't quite recognize the person in the mirror. The eyes are yours, but the light behind them isn't. This is what Jung called the slow collapse of the self, the inner disconnection that follows self-betrayal. When you suppress your instincts, your needs, your boundaries long enough, the psyche begins to hollow out. The energy that once moved toward life now turns inward, feeding on itself. You start to exist, but you no longer live. You speak in careful sentences. You measure your laughter. You watch yourself from a distance like a stranger rehearsing emotions. And deep inside, something mourns what was once real. Jung wrote in the ego and the unconscious. When consciousness distances itself too far from the unconscious, man becomes fragmented. The person who once carried a sense of center now floats between personas, pleasing everyone but belonging to no one, least of all to themselves. Disrespect, when repeated, doesn't just wound. It breaks the axis that connects the ego to the self. Without that axis, the personality loses its gravity. You drift through life not guided by meaning, but pulled by habit, fear, and guilt. There's a dangerous alchemy that happens when we are mistreated for too long. We begin to imitate our oppressor. Psychologists call it identification with the aggressor, but Jung saw it as the unconscious, desperate attempt to avoid pain. The mind thinks, if I become like them, maybe they'll stop hurting me. So you start echoing their tone, doubting yourself before they can, criticizing your every move to feel one step ahead of humiliation. The internal tyrant is born and it wears your face. The soul that once longed for peace now settles for control. You begin to walk on eggshells even when you're alone, anticipating rejection that no longer comes from others, but from within. The same voice that used to defend you now disciplines you. The inner dialogue becomes an echo of past disrespect. You're overreacting. You should be grateful. Don't make it worse. Until silence becomes a cage you've learned to decorate. Picture a candle burning from only one side. At first, the flame looks stable, even beautiful. But because it's uneven, the wax melts faster on one edge, warping the base until it can no longer stand. Then, slowly, the flame chokes itself out. That's what happens when your energy is spent entirely on keeping others comfortable. Your inner structure collapses, not from lack of light, but from imbalance. And yet, Jung never saw this collapse as the end. To him, even in humiliation, the shadow holds a secret, the beginning of transformation. The part of you that breaks is also the part that can awaken. The ego, stripped of illusions, finally stands face to face with the unconscious, the realm it feared, yet always belonged to. In Jung's language, this meeting is not destruction, it's initiation. The crack in the mask becomes a doorway to wholeness. So perhaps the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the sense of emptiness aren't punishments, they're invitations. The psyche is calling you back, asking you to reclaim the pieces lost to fear and compliance. Because sometimes, before we can rediscover who we are, life must first strip away who we pretended to be. But how do you turn this collapse into rebirth? How do you transform disrespect, the very thing that silenced you, into the force that finally awakens you? That's where Jung's most hopeful discovery begins, when the pain itself becomes a path toward consciousness. Healing begins the moment you stop begging for respect and start embodying it. Jung believed that transformation is never sudden. It's a slow remembering of who you were before you learned to hide. The path from a broken mirror to a conscious reflection unfolds in 4 sacred steps. Each one brings you closer to yourself. First, recognition. You can't change what you refuse to see. This is where awareness begins, not in anger, but in observation. Notice the small gestures that make you shrink. The interruption mid-sentence, the dismissive tone, the forced laugh that doesn't feel like yours. Don't rush to judge or justify. Simply name what happens. As Jung taught, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Recognizing what wounds you is not weakness. It's the birth of consciousness. Practice this quietly. The next time you feel disrespected, pause before reacting. Breathe. Feel the energy in your body. Tight shoulders, dry throat, heavy chest. That's the psyche speaking. Write it down later. Keep a mirror journal. Name the moments that dim your light, not to keep the pain alive, but to understand the pattern. Because naming the invisible is the first act of liberation. Second, integration of the shadow. This is where compassion enters. When you realize that people project what they can't face within themselves, you stop taking everything personally. The person who mocks your sensitivity fears their own vulnerability. The one who controls you is terrified of their own chaos. Jung said that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. The shadow others throw at you often mirrors the one you've disowned. Instead of reacting, observe. What part of me feels wounded, and what is it trying to teach? Integration isn't approval, it's understanding. You can forgive without inviting someone back into your life. You can see their pain without carrying it. The goal isn't to fix others, but to retrieve the power you've been giving away through resentment. When you see projections clearly, they dissolve, and what remains is freedom. Third, conscious action. Once awareness and understanding meet, you're ready for boundaries. Not walls, but doors with locks you control. A conscious boundary doesn't shout. It speaks calmly and firmly. It sounds like, that tone doesn't work for me, or I'm not available for this conversation right now. It's not about revenge. It's about alignment. When you act from self-respect, you teach others how to meet you on that same frequency. Try these small but powerful actions. Practice active silence, listening deeply without absorbing what isn't yours. Write down the situations that hurt and how you wish you had responded. Then rehearse that new response aloud. Stand before a mirror and say, "No," with your eyes open, voice steady. It may feel strange at first, but that no is sacred. It's the sound of your spirit setting itself free. Fourth, inner legacy. Respect, once reclaimed, becomes a quiet strength. You begin to choose relationships that honor truth over comfort, mutual growth over compliance. You stop chasing belonging and start embodying it. You realize that love without respect isn't love. It's dependency dressed as devotion. Jung believed that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, always begins with reclaiming the lost dialogue between self and soul. The true mirror is now inside you. Every act of self-care, every honest word, every boundary held with grace polishes that reflection. And when you treat yourself with reverence, the world gradually learns to follow. Because people learn how to love you by watching how you love yourself. But beware, once the ego tastes this newfound strength, it can twist it into pride. It can make you mistake defensiveness for dignity or superiority for self-respect. And that's the next trap waiting on the path, the one that turns healing into another mask. The danger of awakening is that the ego often wants to take credit for it. The same voice that once whispered, "You're not enough," begins to murmur, "Now you're better than them." This is where many lose themselves again, mistaking awareness for superiority, strength for control, peace for indifference. Jung warned that every light casts a shadow, and the brighter the consciousness, the more carefully we must watch our motives. The first trap is ego inflation, the illusion that self-respect means dominance. After finally learning to say no, you might start saying it as a weapon instead of a boundary. You confuse dignity with defiance, presence with power over others. The voice of the wounded self becomes a crown declaring, "I will never be disrespected again." But superiority is still insecurity in disguise. It's the same wound, just wearing armor. Jung saw this as inflation. When the ego identifies with the self and believes itself divine, the result isn't freedom but fragility. Because any challenge now feels like an attack on your throne. Then comes the savior complex, the temptation to teach, fix, or awaken everyone around you. Once you see the patterns of projection, it's easy to spot them in others, and hard to resist pointing them out. You begin to think your role is to rescue people from their unconsciousness. But the truth is, no one changes through correction. They change through readiness. The savior complex is another form of control, one that hides under compassion. It drains your energy and keeps you entangled in the same dynamic you're trying to escape. Sometimes love means stepping back and letting others meet their own lessons. The third trap is spiritual isolation, that subtle withdrawal that feels like wisdom but is actually fear. After being hurt, you might decide solitude equals safety, mistaking pride for peace. You tell yourself, "I don't need anyone anymore." You call it independence, but it's really disconnection. Jung described individuation not as separation from the world, but as union with the self within it. True confidence doesn't close the heart. It opens it wider, rooted in awareness rather than arrogance. And then there's emotional repression, the most silent of all. After so much chaos, stillness feels like salvation. You start equating peace with numbness, calm with avoidance. But serenity without feeling isn't healing. It's escape. You can't transcend what you refuse to feel. The unconscious doesn't vanish because you've learned beautiful words for it. It waits behind the quiet, longing to be lived through, not bypassed. Picture this. You built your new self like a knight's armor, crafted from lessons, boundaries, and strength. It gleams under the light of your growth, a golden armor forged by survival. From the outside, it looks magnificent, resilient, wise, untouchable. But inside, it's hard to breathe. The armor protects, yet it also isolates. It keeps the arrows out, yes, but it also keeps tenderness from getting in. You end up alone in your shining shell, mistaking safety for wholeness. That's a final paradox. The ego demands to be seen. The self simply is. The ego shouts, "Respect me." The self radiates quiet dignity that needs no defense. The ego insists on being feared. The self embodies calm presence. Jung once wrote that the self is not an inflated ideal but a lived center, the axis that holds the opposites without breaking. When you act from this center, respect stops being a negotiation. It becomes a natural extension of your being. So the journey isn't about building a stronger mask. It's about learning to live without one. It's about realizing that the truest power never constricts. It breathes. The armor you once needed for protection becomes unnecessary once you remember your worth. And when you finally set that armor down, when you release the need to prove, to fix, to guard yourself against every wound, something extraordinary begins to happen. It's quiet, almost invisible at first, but it changes everything. There comes a moment when the fight ends, not because you've won, but because you finally remembered who you are. You no longer chase respect or demand recognition. You simply stand differently. Your spine straightens without effort. Your breath deepens. Your eyes meet the world not to convince, but to connect. The same silence that once felt like punishment now feels like peace. This is what it means to return to yourself, to move through life no longer reacting, but responding from the stillness of your soul. The mirror that once reflected distortion is now clear. You see yourself, not the roles you played, not the masks you wore, not the wounds you try to hide, but the being beneath it all, the light that was always there, waiting for the fog to lift. Every fragment of the broken mirror has been gathered, polished by awareness, and pieced back together into something stronger than before. The reflection isn't perfect, but it's true. You realize now that the absence of respect from others says nothing about your worth. It reveals their level of consciousness, not your value. You no longer take disrespect personally, because you understand it symbolically. Those who cannot meet you with presence are still lost in their own noise. And instead of reacting, you silently bless them and walk on. The world hasn't necessarily changed, but your perception has, and that changes everything. Jung once wrote in The Man and His Symbols, man can only realize himself through the knowledge and acceptance of his unconscious. That acceptance is where real power lives, not the kind that shouts or demands, but the kind that rests. When you embrace your wounded dignity, instead of denying it, it transforms. It stops bleeding and begins to teach. Every pain you survive becomes wisdom. Every humiliation becomes understanding. You begin to sense that every encounter, even the cruel ones, was guiding you back to your own center. Respect, you learn, was never something to be earned. It was something to be remembered. It's not given by others. It's awakened within. When you honor your inner truth, you become unshakable, not because you're invincible, but because you no longer abandon yourself. That is the quiet revolution Jung spoke of, the merging of consciousness and unconscious, where the divided self becomes whole. You start walking through the world not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who embodies it. So you speak calmly now, not to dominate, but to express clarity. You hold silence, not as withdrawal, but as wisdom. You look people in the eye and see beyond their words. You know what they're saying, even when they don't speak, because you've learned the language of energy, of truth, of presence. And the beauty is, you no longer need anyone to mirror your worth, because you've cleaned the mirror within. This is a freedom that comes when the unconscious and conscious finally meet, when the shadow, the wound, and the light all take their rightful places. It's not grand. It's not loud. It's simply whole. The kind of strength that doesn't need applause to know its own magnitude. True respect is born when inner silence replaces a need to prove. If this video spoke to your soul, comment below. I choose the respect that comes from within. And continue your journey of self-knowledge and individuation by watching the next episode. We'll explore how boundaries become bridges, and how saying no can be the most spiritual act of all.